Welcome to Captivity Chronicles this lovely June 1st day of 2023. I am Val Burgess and invite you to embrace Leonard Robinson, a man who was a POW of the Imperial Japanese during World War II. In this narrative, I mean no ill will of the Japanese at all. I am simply telling the history as the events were told to me and my research on these events. My hope is that this story will affect you and teach you how to better your life. So let's dig in. I do have a content warning that this story contains truthful and yet graphic content that might be offensive or disturbing to some audiences. So I recommend viewer discretion. During World War I, Japan fought with the coalition of countries led by France, Great Britain, Russia, Italy, against the Central Powers of Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. In fact, the Japanese had their warships that served in the Mediterranean Sea. Some historians say that World War II was simply a continuation of World War I because things were not really settled after World War I. Prior to World War II, Japan, a country with few natural resources, relied on the world to provide them with these natural resources. Across the Pacific, many countries were colonizing territories in order that they too could have availability to these vital assets of resources, and thus being able to grow their countries, make it healthy for their citizenry. During the negotiations of the Versailles Treaty, at the table were Great Britain, the United States, and France. Japan asked that they could be a participant at the table and were rebuked and told no. You know, I think it really made the Japanese feel snubbed because they had fought with us during World War I. The worldwide depression really made countries struggle, and to satisfy their needs for their countrymen and see their economy grow or somehow get out of the depression, many were determined to make changes. Japan, like many, were determined to build their country and build what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So they would propagate this strategy throughout Asian territories occupied by Japan from 1931 to 1945. However, this propagation of the prosperity sphere was brutal to those that lived in the Japanese occupied territories. Japan was not alone in its quest to add territories for resources. Many countries had made claims to lands for the resources availed to them. The Netherlands, the United States, Britain, Germany, all kinds of countries were vying for lands so that they could have more and more resources for their people. Japan at the time, between World War I and World War II, they had a very strong military. In fact, their military was building a railroad in Manchuria. And the military simply took over Manchuria. And I don't know that that was actually the plan for their military, but they did it anyway. They also wanted to rule the country, and so tried to control the Japanese Diet, which was their legislative branch of government. Many of the Diet members were murdered over control of the country. The Japanese military was already claiming territory, like I said, Manchuria, and moving through other areas of the Pacific. Because of the military strength and presence, they wanted control over Japan, and they wanted control over the transferred territories. The US felt that Japan was overstepping their bounds and placed embargoes on them in in early 1940s. I'm not sure if it was 39, 40. I think it was 39 or 40. These embargoes limited the amount of rubber, steel, and fuel and oil that they could purchase from the United States. That meant that Japan had limited fuel and only really a few years worth if they didn't go to war. If they went to war, I believe they had 1 year's worth of oil, worth of fuel, so that they could win a war. It didn't put the restraints on the Japanese. While this was a simplification for the causes of war, it shares vital information to understand why the Japanese felt boxed in a corner and came out fighting. This is my solemn promise to the World War II prisoners of war. As long as I can speak, I will tell their stories. As long as I can learn, I will study their narratives. As long as I live, I will teach you their life lessons that they taught me. Today, I think we can feel this, but it wasn't so much the case back in the 1940s. But war really is a seminal event in the life of anyone who experiences this, who experiences war. I know I can see it in the veterans coming home from the Gulf War, from the Iraq War, men who were in Vietnam and in Korea. I can see or I can feel the difference because I've interviewed enough people to understand, not not fully understand, but certainly have some glimpse of what war did to change their lives. World War II veterans, especially those that became prisoners of war, have much to teach us about how to live our lives. Now, not all of them were able to come through it well, but some certainly did. And for the men serving in the Pacific, their God, their strength, and willpower kept them from eternity as they persevered through the inhumanity of their captors. I ask you to listen to this story so that you learn just what this generation gave to provide you with a better life. Please allow yourself to visualize the brutality of the Pacific theater of war during World War II. It was December 7th, 1941, in Pearl Harbor, a day that will live in infamy. With the destruction of Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese, set their sights on the Philippines, attacking the islands en masse. The capture of these lands was crucial to Japan's effort to control the Southwest Pacific. They needed to seize the rich resources of the Dutch East Indies and protect its Southeast Asian flank that they already had. This strategy called for simultaneous attacks on Malaya, Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and American-held Guam, Wake, and Hawaii. So the same time they were attacking Pearl Harbor, or within a few days, all of those other locations were attacked, really stirring up things. Across the international date line on the U.S. territory in the Philippines, it was December 8th, 1941. In the U.S., we understand it as December 7th, 1941, but the men across the international date line always remember it as December 8th. They remember that quite well. The Imperial Japanese had been colonizing, like I said, across the Pacific as they determined to build a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, meaning they wanted land and resources to support Japan in a way they could thrive and not depend on other countries. Manila, Manila Bay, the Philippines was key to the control of the shipping lanes in the Pacific. And the Imperial Japanese Navy were determined to minimize U.S. interference in this vital area. That made the Philippines an important target. There's also a tadpole-shaped island when you go into Manila Bay. If you control Corregidor, which it is called, you can not allow people to go into Manila Bay. And certainly Manila Bay was the central, most busy port in the Pacific. And that's the reason they wanted it. Staff Sergeant Len Robinson had finished his night patrol from 4 to 6 a.m. in the morning at Clark Field, some 60 miles north of Manila. He was a member of the 20th Coastal Artillery Corps and a draftee of the New Mexico National Guard. He was scheduled to leave the Philippines for the U.S. because he was finishing his service. His unit, the 200th Coastal Artillery, became the premier anti-aircraft unit in the Army. They left the mainland, mainly Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, on August 30th. An additional group of people, the 2nd Battalion, loaded up on the USS President Coolidge and left in September of 1941. None of them knew where they were going. However, they ended up in the Philippines. Upon their arrival in the Philippines, they were assigned to to protect Clark Field and Fort Stotzenburg, north of Manila. There were 1,800 men, officers, and enlisted men who were to guard that airfield. They found much of their ammunition was defective, as much of it was from World War I. The Army soldiers stationed there also did not appreciate these men because they were Army and had been trained, and the 200th Coastal Artillery were simply National Guard. National Guard. Hearing the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Len Robinson knew he would serve for the duration of the war, whatever that meant. Little did he know how close his war was. It was just hours away. According to an article by Darren Court of White Sands Missile Range Museum, in the early morning hours of 8 December 1941, it was still December 7th, 1941, at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese land-based naval bombers and Zero fighters from Formosa, which is now called Taiwan, were detected by radar heading in the direction of Manila. American planes were alerted and took off from Clark Field, but failed to connect with the Japanese aircraft. For the Americans that morning, it was quite confusing because reports came out that the Japanese had bombed Clark Field, and yet they were going about their business just like they would any day. Seemingly unsure of the threat, even 6 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the commander of the U.S. Army forces in the Far East, Lieutenant General Arthur Douglas MacArthur, forbade his Air Corps commanders from sending additional aircraft up on reconnaissance missions. Instead, the men went to the showers, to the mess hall, and checked on their soldiers who had enjoyed a large party the night before. Following night watch, Len Robinson fell asleep and missed his ride to breakfast. His men left without them, although they did have the excuse that they tried to wake him up, and he admits he has a tough time coming out of sleep. Both of those men in a vehicle headed for Stotzenburg were instantly killed by the first Japanese bombs dropped on Clark Field. This was the first time Robinson escaped death. It was just after noon when the Japanese aircraft attacked by bombing and strafing runs at Clark Field. The first to fire on the Imperial Japanese were Leonard Robinson and the men of the 200th Coastal Artillery Corps, who experienced incredible difficulty in defending any and all air attacks because, like I said, their ammunition was faulty. Their 3-inch ammunition, the most recent of which was manufactured in 1932, had a high percentage of duds. Most of the fuses were badly corroded. Only 1 of every 6 shells fired actually exploded in the air. Historian William Manchester wrote in American Caesar, Douglas MacArthur, 1880 to 1964. He wrote, "The Japanese, as they told their post-war interrogators, could hardly believe their good fortune. There lay their prey, bunched together with wingtips almost touching. The 3 B-17 fortresses waiting to take off were the first to go. They exploded within seconds of each other. The attackers came in 3 waves: heavy bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. The fish-tailing bombs were terrifying, but the strafing Zeros inflicted greater damage. Coming in low, they ignited one fuel tank after another with tracer bullets. As these blew up, the operations office, the field headquarters, and the fighter control shack erupted in flame. By 1:37 p.m., when the last Japanese plane soared away, Clark Field was unrecognizable, destroyed, and with it, much of the Pacific Fleet. Here is a slide of Clark Field. And here is what it looked like after the Japanese approached with their bombers, fighters, and other aircraft to destroy Clark Field. They did a great job. The next day, after the Pacific Fleet, much of the Pacific Fleet aircraft were destroyed, America declared war on the Japanese. Len finally returned to his barracks at Fort Stotzenburg sometime later and showered. It would be his last warm shower for 3 years and 5 months. Imagine unable to shower well for 3 years and 5 months. It's almost unbelievable in our day and age. War in the Philippines was tough. Much World War equipment and ammunition were supplied, meaning the U.S. military efforts were really ineffective and many times failed. Imagine those poor men at Manila, all over the Philippines, who had military equipment that simply failed them. On Christmas Day of the two th- on Christmas Day, the 200th Coastal Artillery Corps left Clark Field to make the journey down to the Bataan Peninsula. By January 7th, 1942, the remaining U.S. and Filipino soldiers and civilians retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. The soldiers still had hope that they would be safe on Bataan, hope that that the U.S. would bring substantial stores of food, hope that replacement soldiers would come and ease their burden. None of these hopes were realized. Unknown to General Jonathan Wainwright, the senior field commander of American and Filipino forces, he was unaware that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill had agreed on a Europe First strategy for the war. That meant the men in the Philippines who were hoping for and expecting reinforcements that would never come. Sergeant David Johns would state that the Voice of Freedom radio broadcast kept telling us, "Hold out for 2 more days. Help is on the way." The men said we could take the truth, but they lied to us. Imagine the government lied to them, telling them that there were replacement soldiers, there was food coming to them and ammunition. By April 9th, just 4 months after their retreat, nearly every soldier on Bataan had at least 2 diseases: malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, bloody diarrhea, and afflictions due to malnutrition, such as beriberi. For 3 months, the soldiers, both men and women who were nurses taking care of those injured on Bataan, lived on 15 ounces of rice, canned meat, and milk. Perhaps an occasional monkey, snake, or lizard was part of their diet. Near the end of their service, they received less than 1,000 calories a day while in combat. I'm going to show you a slide. These are the guns that the Coastal Artillery Corps fired. This is not at Clark Field, but at another airfield in Luzon. And you can see how badly damaged it is. The aircraft were just taken out. Truthfully, most of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft were gone after December 8th. The thousands of military personnel on Bataan were spent. They had extinguished their physical and military resources and were failing fast. On that day, April 9th, 1942, the Battling Bastards of Bataan were surrendered. Had they not given up, it would have meant a wholesale slaughter of the men without achieving any military advantage. General King had to surrender his men. But what that did was cause a terrible event to occur. You see, the Japanese believed in Bushido, which was an ancient samurai philosophy that they kind of, changed to their own likes, which allowed the military to be rogue. Among the battling bastards of Bataan who surrendered was Len Robinson. Here is a photo, just a single photo of the Bataan, the men on Bataan marching. There were lots. There were the notorious Bataan Death March soon followed their surrender. Approximately 75,000 Filipinos and 10,000 Americans were forced marched north for some 65 miles from Mariveles to San Fernando in sweltering heat and with no food or water. They had already been starving, and then this occurred to them. Just depraved, merciless, unattended Japanese soldiers with the opportunity to violate those they captured, and violate them they did. Somewhere along the march, Len and some of the other men were caged in a corral overnight. When they woke up the next morning, Len's shoes were gone, possibly stolen. He couldn't find them. He was racing around trying to find his shoes because you can't complete the Bataan Death March on the cobblestone roads or the dirt roads without shoes. Two friends from his unit joined in to help him find his shoes, which in fact he did. But by the time he found his shoes, all of the other soldiers, all of the Americans and Filipinos had marched on, leaving Len and his two friends standing at the gate. They were fearful of the Japanese response because the longer they stood there, the more concerned they became. However, by mid-morning, Len's trio, with a group of 15 officers, were loaded in a truck and driven all the way to San Fernando, which was the end of the Bataan Death March. They were able to escape a large portion of marching because Len had lost his shoes. They avoided the barbaric and deadly march. Historically, the Bataan Death March is one of the most vile, one of the most brutal experiences and inhumane events during World War II. Everyone seems to know about the Bataan Death March, whether you know a lot about it, but you know that it was certainly a bad event for American, for Allied soldiers. Ruthlessly, at the beginning of the march and all through it, many of the Allied POWs were executed. By that, I mean the Filipinos and the Americans. The Japanese were too concerned, really, about their next assault, which would have been Corregidor, the tadpole-shaped island that was at the mouth of Manila Bay, to really care about their captives. The weary Americans and Filipino soldiers were forced to march in the blistering sun without water and nutrition for their already starving bodies. At the start of the march, men were beheaded for really just about anything. Many of them were ran over and looked like roadkill, smashed on the roadways by deuce and a half trucks that the Japanese had captured. One of the men was so thirsty, or some of the men became so thirsty that they ran for the ditches, wallow, where Caraboa, almost like kind of a bison or a buffalo-like character, and they rolled in them. And the men ran for those places so that they could get something to drink because they were just so thirsty. Those men were exterminated. They were punished by being executed because they attempted to get some water. One fellow had a canteen over his shoulder. A Japanese soldier crossed the roadway and grabbed it from him, took a drink out of it, and poured some in his own canteen. He then poured the remainder of the water on the ground and threw down the canteen. The American soldier went over to get his canteen, and the Japanese guard took the butt of his gun and hit him in the face with it. He walked away, leaving his canteen for his water there. Because Japan had not formally ratified the convention, the Japanese soldiers violated that Geneva Convention that had been ratified by at least 34 countries. The General Homa, who was in charge of capturing the Philippines, was later tried and found guilty for the violations of this convention. He was put to death for his lack of control over his men. Mere days after the Bataan Death March, the POWs were transported in oven-like rail cars north. These rail cars were so crowded that if someone died in it and they left the car once they met their destination, that dead person remained standing at attention in the car. Also, if anyone was pushed up against the wall of the metal rail car, they typically would burn themselves because it was so hot in the Philippines at that time. The men were then marched miles to a newly built prison camp. Camp O'Donnell, their new camp, was less than a mile in diameter and was constructed to hold 8,000 prisoners of war. Some 50,000 men were jammed inside this barbed wire enclosure. Water and housing were non-existent. It was a determined effort to stay alive when everything was lethal. Len told me our guards' actions were sadistic in nature. We feared them. At O'Donnell, surrounded by barbed wire, sick and dying men laid everywhere. Their feces ran out of their pant legs. We slept outside with no blankets. Our only protection was our clothes. Len moved away from those sick and dying near the fence, away from the smell and those ravaged by dysentery and other diseases. He laid down on that far side of the barbed wire and stretched his legs outside of the wire. For the next 48 days, they were filled with massive loss of life. Most died of dysentery, a bacterial or amoebic infection causing bloody or mucus stools. It was caused by the filthy water they had to drink. However, soon malaria caused even more deaths. Len said death at O'Donnell came as a relief to the sick, starved, and diseased men. Of the 9,000 American men that entered O'Donnell, nearly 1,600 died over the 6-week period of internment there. If we had remained until Labor Day, all of us would have died. Unknown to the prisoners, the guards linked 10 men together. It was just a setup that they set up. They set up 10 men together as a group. If one of those men attempted or escaped, the entire 9 or 10 of them, if they caught the escapee, were murdered. They exterminated them. This limited the escape attempts. Lynn said it took a determined effort to stay alive when death was all around you. Can you imagine surviving this kind of treatment? Starvation and becoming ill by drinking water that you only had access to? Think how depressing this must have been, watching your friend or those who served with you dying needlessly. Finally, in June of 1942, and continually, small groups of men were evacuated from Camp O'Donnell to Camp Cabanatuan. Here you see a map that was drawn in a book called Of Rice and Men. You can see all these places. This book was written by a fellow who one man had a roll of 2¼ film. The others made a jig so that they could cut it in half and put it in a camera that one of the other men had. They cut that. And so in this book and some of the photographs that you're going to see were done by that camera with the film that they jigged to fit. It's just incredible. And this map is simply to tell whoever got back to the camp first was able to find those photographs, which they did. Camp Cabanatuan was some 100 miles south of Manila. The prisoners fared much better there because at that camp there was water, food, medicine, and barracks in limited supply, but sometimes they were available. For a time at Cabanatuan, Len worked the burial detail. They would have a large grass mat in which they laid the deceased POW in the center of. There were 4 men. Each carried the corner of that mat with the deceased in between them. If they stepped wrongly, the deceased POW would fall on the ground. One day, as they carried a man, Len needed to step over a ditch and made that known to the other carriers, who he thought would follow him. Instead, they stopped. They didn't move. Len fell. The deceased POW fell on top of him, gazing at him with a deadly stare. Within 2 days, Len Robinson had diphtheria from the deceased POW. When you are starving and in a prison camp in the Pacific, diphtheria is a disease that kills easily. It's lethal. At Cabanatuan, all the prisoners there's Cabanatuan. The men don't look so bad, so this must be an early photograph. But eventually, in the prison camps, the men started to look like this. But all diphtheria patients, including Len Robinson, were isolated in the 0 ward. The 0 ward was nothing more than a place where they went to die because nobody usually survived diphtheria. Len started getting sick. His throat was closing. He was paralyzed, and he knew death neared. And then, little by little by little, he gained strength. In fact, of the 5 men that survived the diphtheria ward, the 0 ward, Len Robinson was one of them. Now, I wouldn't say that diphtheria was a perk, but Lynn said, in fact, it was. Because when you had diphtheria, none of the other POWs wanted to be near you. And so the guards placed those 5 people away from everybody. Bed bugs didn't want to crawl on you. Any of those lice or vermin, they didn't want to be near you because you had diphtheria. And so the isolation away from the masses was actually a perk, a benefit, because these men didn't have to work. They were able to heal themselves, take care of one another, and they survived to live another day. I just want you to look at these. These are the Japanese guards are throwing bones to the humans that acted like dogs. And here you see a guard. He's looking at the poor rations these poor, skinny men are receiving from the Japanese. His face even shows some disgust. In this photograph, you can see, well, I think it's a drawing, excuse me. You can see the prisoners moving a hut. And over here, they're working in the rice paddies to grow rice for the Japanese. It wasn't for them, certainly. Here, these men are being deloused as there's an air raid on. Here is a guard. I can't seem to remember his name, but he is showing punishment to the men. You can see he kicked him in the knees. This guy, he's going to club him. And here you see one of the guards making the men slap each other and enjoying that event. Here you see men waiting to go into the 00 ward. This These men are ready to die. And then you see them being carried, it looks like on a stretcher, which in fact was not what Len Robinson used. And here's the cemetery. And here the men are moving rations for the Japanese in order for them to eat. "24 months later, as the war progressed, Japan desperately needed laborers. Hell ships, as they were called, and for good reason, transported thousands of Allied POWs for slave labor to Japanese occupied territories all across the Pacific. I know men who were on those ships for almost 3 to 4 months and had just a few days of that time when they were out of the holds of these filthy ships and got on land. Hell ships were not a joke. In the movie about, I can't remember. At any rate, hell ships were something that no one would ever want to experience. The men were held in the hulls of unmarked freighters. POWs were moved for months and for thousands of miles aboard these ships. In the dark, dank, filthy holds, men endured all the horrors of prison camp magnified by tenfold. Little food or water was provided. Some attempted to drink human waste. Others slit their wrist and drank blood. They were so thirsty. Sanitary facilities were strictly their tattered clothing. Human dignity and decency was destroyed. Some resorted to cannibalism. Americans killed Americans in an attempt to survive another day on a hell ship. Approximately 3 out of every 4 prisoners died aboard the hell ships. Many of these hell ships were sunk by Allied torpedoes, killing thousands of prisoners. The government justified their killing because they didn't want the Japanese to know they knew their codes. They didn't want the Japanese to know these codes had been broken. Land ships sailed in September of 43 and docked in Moji City. The men were then moved by train up the western shoreline of Japan's largest island, Honshu. Tokyo is on Honshu. By morning, they traveled over the mountains and up the coastline to Niigata, to a prisoner of war camp. On this coast of northern Honshu, Robinson would spend the next 23 months. The men wondered if their motto, Golden Gate in 48, I may be late, but I can't wait, was true. as they moved further and further away from their homeland. Niigata was a port where the cold literally seeped through your skin to your bones. Len's first winter there had 25 to 30 feet of snow. At night, the 5 ration blankets did nothing to warm them. They slept on or in their wet clothes in an attempt to dry them so that when they went outside the next day, they weren't so wet. One evening, and from the heavy snowfalls, the barracks collapsed on Len. Once again, he cheated death. Leonard's assigned unit was being a stevedore on the docks of Niigata, and initially he moved pig iron from carts to the ground into rail cars. For their labor, they were paid 5 cents a day. Their food rations barely sustained them and caused slow starvation. In an earlier and happier time, Len had studied engineering at the University of Colorado and learned efficiency. In Niigata, he applied that skill, working to make the men's labor easier and at the same time keeping his mind clear. By doing so, the guards were rewarded, the wagon drivers made more money, and the men stood a better chance of survival. Len simply convinced one of the cart drivers, a woman, to drive up next to the rail car and let him unload the pig iron into the rail car. She made more money, and the other drivers of those carts saw it and wanted to do the same. The guards were doing well. The men and women who were operating the carts with I'm not sure if it was horses or what kind of animal was drawing it, made everything better for all of them because of Len's ingenuity. The guards noticed that when they gave them an extra bowl of beans, the men worked harder and more was accomplished. So then they decided that they should have a bowl of bean soup daily. While the prisoners grew in strength, they were careful not to show it in order to save their strength. One day, U.S. aircraft were seen overhead. The men knew Uncle Sam neared. The homeland was a little closer. After nearly 2 years held at Niigata, the first Allied dive bomber attacked the airfield and refinery. And then, on August 10th, 1945, an all-out battle raged near the stevedores by raiding Allied planes and a Japanese destroyer. In late August, leaflets were dropped by the United States from B-29s. Overnight, the entirety of Niigata City disappeared and was evacuated. The men's liberation neared. Fortunately, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. If they hadn't, Niigata would have been one of the next targets for the atom bomb. Those leaflets were a warning to the people of Niigata. The U.S. had purchased 500,000 body bags for the invasion of Japan. Had Japan not surrendered, many more people would have died, both Americans, Japanese, all nationalities. Their surrender saved countless American POWs from certain death. Len's saga quickly began its inevitable conclusion. Remember, Len became a prisoner on April 9th, 1942. It was now August 15th, 1945. The men were lined up that morning to work and then dismissed. They were dismissed. The guards told them the war was over with. They had been captives of the Japanese for nearly 3.5 years. On August 20th, it finally sunk in that this was not a dream. Leonard Robinson finally had a peaceful night's rest with the release of all the pressure. On August 29th, 2 American B-29 aircraft dropped 55-gallon drums of food, medicines, clothing, enough for the men to have 6 meals a day. Len and the others began to gain weight. On September 5th, Robinson and the other POWs caught a train to Tokyo and saw a city that had been totally destroyed. He then made his way to Yokohama, where a hospital ship with a big red cross awaited on the dock for those deemed ill. A nurse from the hospital ship asked his group of former POWs if she could help them. And one man asked her to just go stand by that building. We just want to see you. We haven't seen an American woman in a very long time. On September 8th, Len was flown to Manila. And on September 19th, 1945, at 1 p.m., Robinson began his journey home, the last leg that began in April of 1942 on the peninsula of Bataan. Staff Sergeant Leonard Robinson of the 200th Coastal Artillery Corps escaped death many times. But what he did, he affirmed to me that when he left Tokyo, he forgave his captors. He closed the book on that chapter of his life and remained free from trauma the rest of his life. He told me he could teach people how to heal themselves. He said, trust in God, Jesus, turn your life over to whatever higher power you believe in. Learn to tell your story, not all the gory details, but become comfortable with your story. And then forgive unconditionally, not for them, but for you. Leonard Robinson was so successful with forgiveness that he was studied in the 1950s to learn why he didn't have night terrors, post-traumatic stress disorder, or moral injury. He completely forgave. The day that I met Len Robinson, he used a cane to walk up the sidewalk on the stairs and enter his home. He appeared very old and was bent over and moved slowly. After many hours of his testimony, I noticed his face grew younger and younger. He suddenly jumped up and ran down the hall to get some memorabilia to show me. He became that younger man. The longer he recounted his story, the more I saw his face transform into that young man that survived extreme adversity as he recalled his war. I have recorded over 175 POWs' oral histories and read many other narratives. Every one of them has taught me its own important life lesson. These stories can do the same for you. Leonard Robinson's story is a powerful example of the importance of forgiveness and how it changes one's life. His experience as a POW during World War II were incredibly traumatic, but he was able to find peace and live his life to the fullest by forgiving unconditionally. His story can teach us all about our power of forgiveness and how it can help us overcome trauma and move forward in our lives. Here's another takeaway for you. It is important to learn about people that experience profound trauma. By learning their stories, we can view our adversity in new ways. We can learn how our difficulties changed us or can change us, giving us more strength and becoming more courageous and overcoming our fears and living with passion and more resilience. We then escape the prison camp of our own making. These strategies, I believe, are necessary for living in the world today. I ask you to take a moment to just look at your life, compare what you experienced, and spend some time unraveling your adversities, the difficulties in your life, and see how you can become fearless. You can change things. You can forgive someone. I want you to see Len Robinson, the day he became that young man the day that he shared his story with me. At one point, we'd been together for about 5 hours, which I didn't realize because it went so fast. He said to me, you've got to get going. You're going to be driving home in the dark. And I said, well, it's only about 5 o'clock because we got together at 2. And he said, no, it's 7 in the evening. I was mortified because I couldn't believe, in fact, that we had been together that long. And so I leave with you the lesson about learning to forgive, using the highest power, knowing your story and being able to tell it, not all the gory details, and then forgiving unconditionally. And with that, I close this session of Captivity Chronicles. Next week, I'm going to have a great guest. Her name is Jo Erickson, and her father, Mel Heckman, saw the first action, heard the first sounds, and was very close to the USS Arizona as he was doing his duties and working at Ford Island in the middle of Pearl Harbor. So won't you please join me, and thank you for taking the time to listening to Len Robinson's story. Over and out. See you next week, the 7th, the 8th of June at 3 o'clock for Captivity Chronicles. Thank you so much.